What's up, everybody? This is Grant at Cause Artist. Welcome to another episode of the Disruptors for Good podcast. Today, I'm excited to chat with Derwin Sisnett, the founder and CEO of Adapted Commons, a real estate development firm focused on transforming public spaces for the greater good. He previously co-founded Maslow Development, which specializes in mixed-use communities centered on high-quality schools. As co-founder and former CEO of Gestalt community schools in Memphis, he developed a high-performing network of charter schools recognized by the White House and the U.S. Department of Education. Derwin also co-founded the Obsidian Catalyst Fund, empowering Black real estate developers. His work has been featured in major publications like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He has also lectured at institutions like Harvard and Yale. Derwin has a tremendous story, very inspiring. I love this conversation. I love everything that he has done in his life so far and will continue to do in the future. An awesome conversation. I hope you take a lot away from it. I hope everyone's having a great day. Have a great week. We'll talk soon. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Derwin, so much, man, for joining me today. You've done some incredible things in your life, and really excited to dive into your journey in life so far, a little bit of your career journey and arc up to now being a CEO of Adapted Commons and everything that's doing to revitalize local real estate in our cities, which, I think we all think there's so much potential there. And it's amazing to see people actually doing it, not just talking about it. So before we get into Adaptive Commons, talk about your incredible journey so far. You've done so much in life, and start wherever you kind of want to start, but let's deep dive into that career arc before now.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and thanks for having me. I always like to start from not so much the beginning, but really a place that I think set the foundation for everything that I do. So, native New Yorker, born and raised in Queens, specifically Far Rockaway. And Far Rockaway is near and dear to me because of all that it taught me growing up. And it really was the first time and first place where I really thought about the built environment. I didn't articulate it as a kid back then as the built environment, but there was certainly something that was stewing when I think about the middle school I attended and, the shapes and the spaces. When I think about the high school I attended, which was outside of Far Rockaway, and the difference, that I experienced there was just something about Far Rockaway that shaped me. And so Far Rockaway, for those of you who don't know, it is essentially, to this day, still has one of the highest concentrations of public housing in the country. It is, on one hand, it is, on the beach, on the Atlantic Ocean. On the other hand, it is, as the name infers, it's far away. And so it's, somewhat disconnected from, the other boroughs in a sense, one of the last stops on the A train. And so you get this sense of, connectivity when you're there, but then also this sense of disconnection, I should say. And so when I went to high school, because it was in a different environment and in a much more affluent, neighborhood, and actually sat on a college campus, I went to Townsend Harris. And so it's on Queens College campus, just a different world. And so when I experienced both Townsend Harris and Far Rockaway, that really solidified for me that I wanted to lean into the built environment. I realized there were kids who looked like me who didn't have the same experiences that I had simply because of the environment that was around us. And so after graduate school, I landed in Memphis, Tennessee. I started a school. I was leading a community development corporation. And the first initiative we had was to start a charter school. And it was in a neighborhood called Hickory Hill that was very much like Far Rockaway, I like to say, in that there were areas of blight that people were just sort of walking by and hoping that somebody would do something with one day. And at the same time, there was just this amazing fabric of people. Even growing up in Far Rockaway, I wouldn't be where I was if it wasn't for my friends, my family, who really stood by me and connected me and kept me grounded. And in the same way, Hickory Hill had that, yet the built environment, like Far Rockaway, just needed some love. And so while the first charter school that I founded, Power Center Academy, although it went on to do well out the gate, it really, for me, it really made me think about my own upbringing. And I kept thinking, wow, I'm doing the same thing to our kids that was done to me, and that they're getting a great education in the four walls of a classroom, but they still got to go home. And we need more people focused on what home looks like. And so, I worked very closely with Yetta Lewis, who founded Power Center Academy with me. And we talked about not only what happens in the classroom, but what we could do outside. And I started to think about this old abandoned apartment complex called the Marina Cove. And I would drive by it every day. I would think about our kids who walked by it or drove by it every day. And I mean, it was in such bad shape. I wish I could show you pictures, but To paint the picture, there were 394 units that were all collectively appraised at $100. At one point, it was the place to be. It had canals running through it. You almost like hear the children playing. But by the time, by 2005, 2007 or so, it was just in ruins. And in fact, it was declared a public nuisance. No one could even live there. By the time we said, you know what, let's do something about this. And so with no development experience, but really feeling like I had the wind behind my sails, given how Power Center Academy was doing, I thought, you know what, let me just get into the real estate business. And so, still with the social orientation, I remember, I had no experience. My background is, BA in psychology. At the time I had an MFA in creative writing. And so nothing qualified me to get into real estate development. And yet somehow, there were some amazing people that were around me, right? You always want to make sure you're not the smartest person in the room. And so I still like to do that. And so there were folks who helped me to think about, a pitch deck. I didn't know what a pitch deck was at the time. They helped me to think about, what it was to sort of cast a vision, that we wanted to really get other folks to get behind. And so somehow, some way, we were able to assemble capital to buy that property. And when I say assemble the capital, it was essentially nothing, right? The property was so blighted, yet the land was worth $1.6 million. And so because we were a nonprofit, $1 million of that was a tax write-off. And then there was another $600,000 that we raised in city grant funding to assemble that. And because there was really smart people around me, one really smart, savvy real estate, guy said, hey, why don't you see if there's more land? And I'm thinking, wow, there's already 24 acres of an apartment complex. And this is my first real estate deal. I'm not sure I want to think about more land. But I did. And I looked around and realized that there was another almost 19 acres of land that was adjacent to that property. But it was landlocked. And so no one knew it was there because the blighted property sat in front of it. And it was all wooded and undeveloped. And at this point, if you think about the timeline, this was the Great Recession. So This is also a time where no one was building, housing and, no one could afford to. And so this group that was based out of Boston owned that property. And we reached out to them and said, hey, can we buy this from you? They had no idea what we intended to do with that property or the old Marina Cove. And so we bought that for next to nothing. And, we were able to cobble some dollars together to do that. And when it was all said and done, we assembled about 43 acres of land. And then we were off to the races, raised some philanthropy, raised some more federal dollars, as well as some new markets tax credits to essentially build what is now Middle School Performing Arts Center, single family homes in partnership with Habitat for Humanity. And then we eyed the shopping plaza directly across the street from that. Which was pretty much, 50% utilized at best, and it had some of the, typical bad actors that you can imagine when there's a blighted property across the street. But what it did have going for it was a medical clinic and dental clinic. And we thought, wow, this is an asset. This is, they're doing great things for the community, and we can park our high school there so that one day maybe we could buy it and then put out an elementary school and round out that K-12 program. And ultimately we did. And so once that was, really going, I stepped back and said, wow, this is the work that I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to think about the built environment and really put the words to action, put a vision into action. And so at that point, I stepped back from Gestalt Community Schools, which was and is the network of charter schools that I co-founded and led with Yetta Lewis. And I then co-founded Maslow Development Inc. With my partner, Nora. And we started to think about how we could do this work, not just in Memphis, but in other places. And so then we were off to Tulsa, Oklahoma and Birmingham, Alabama, and thinking about ways to engage with community members about this same kind of work. And yeah, I know I'm sort of giving you a mouthful. That's sort of giving you the sort of preview as to like how I landed in this space. It was totally, some would say by accident. But when I look back on, Far Rockaway and how it shaped me, it was very much designed this way. And I'm excited to be thinking about this work in a new and innovative way through adaptive commons.
And so you had the blueprint, right? Essentially what happened in Memphis was sort of the blueprint to scale the idea in other areas. You mentioned that, obviously you said you didn't have any experience in real estate, and, coming from outside, you're sort of naive, right? And in a really good way, because it's like, you don't know how hard things are, right? You're just like, oh, let's do this. And you said they had some amazing people and sort of network, around or that you sort of asked questions and people got involved. Is that sort of the protocol going outside of Memphis, right? You mentioned Tulsa, you mentioned like the blueprint of building that network of people that can get stuff done is so important. And it seems like you created that network of people that got stuff done in Memphis. Has that been the case as you took this idea and blueprint to other cities? Has the response been equally as optimistic?
It's absolutely critical, right? It's, they say real estate is local.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, if you're engaging in real estate development and you're not working with local actors and you're not really, supporting them as opposed to sort of bringing them along,
Yeah.
then the project is doomed from the start. And so even with Tulsa, Oklahoma, what made that interesting is that, initially there was a group of folks from Tulsa who came to Memphis to see the work we were doing and asked if we could replicate and if we could sort of do the same thing in Tulsa. And I remember thinking, well, actually, the reason why this works in Memphis is because it's homegrown. And if it's going to work in Tulsa, it also will likely be homegrown. And then, funny enough, a couple of years later, when I was pivoting to then found Maslow, the group from Tulsa bumped into one of the leaders there in DC at a meeting. It was a random, event, and he said, "Hey, so we launched this thing in Tulsa. Come on." And so I said, "Well, guess what? I just launched Maslow. We'll be to join forces." And so we worked closely with them. And again, more behind the scenes, really supporting their efforts because no one knows the work like the folks who are from the community. And so we like to do that. I still like to be the sort of behind the scenes supporting versus, being the one who's out front. And it just makes for a great partnership.
So now Adaptive Commons comes into place. Give us the overall sort of verbal pitch of what the idea is, what the mission and vision is as of today, right now.
So I shared a little bit about Maslow and Gestalt. And so when, some of the things I realized along the way, and it's not so easy to realize this particularly when things are going well, you don't really get a chance to step back and, see where you might have made some, missteps. And so when you're in a city like Memphis or even Tulsa, where there's, good amount of land to go around, you can assemble 43 acres or 24 acres or you can pretty much do that. But when you're in Oakland, California, like I am now, or you're in New York, like where I grew up, or name some of the more dense urban cores, it's not so easy to do. And at the same time, from an environmental standpoint, it might not be the best thing to do, right? When you think about the existing buildings that are sort of left behind. When I look back on the old Marina Cove, if it really still had the bones and it wasn't in such, it would have been a good idea to adapt those buildings and those spaces. It just wasn't set up that way. And so I think about that. And then at the same time, when I was in the charter space and the sort of public education space, I thought about our teachers a lot and I thought about how hard they worked. So, people were patting us on the back and, talking about how, great our kids are doing. And the reason why our kids were doing so well and the scholars were performing is because the teachers were amazing and they were just working their butts off in order to allow for that to happen. And so I started to think more about our teachers and I go back to some of the early conversations and empathy interviews I had with teachers, not just at, in Memphis, but beyond to learn, what their pain points were, which typically don't get asked, right? And so paired that. And then I came across this study that Berkeley, Turner Center, and drawing a blank, UCLA, they put together that talked about the state of schools in California. So now fast forward, now I've got a PhD, and my PhD was focused on how the built environment affects Black males. And that was like really the pointed side of my dissertation. And so, when I reflect on that, I nerded out on this report that came out. And I just started to think about all the buildings that are available just in California, all the land that's available that schools own. And so then I step back again and go, wait, teachers can't afford to live near where they work. School districts own all of these assets that are underutilized or vacant. What if we actually participated those assets? We, contributed those to a project so that they were low cost or no cost, which would then allow for us to revitalize those spaces and reimagine them for housing instead of, just being vacant, and reimagine them for housing for the very own workforce that owns these assets, which are teachers. And then as I've interviewed teachers, I learned, yes, they want to be in community with each other, but they also want to be in community with other essential workers, right? Like first responders and firefighters, what have you. And so if that's the case, how do we take these public assets and still keep them for the public good? And people will ask, like, so are school buildings good for housing? The short answer is yes. And we've seen this before. There are so many examples of them, but they're typically market rates, home apartments, or they're hotels. And so they're these swanky spaces that are amazing, that they're great to have been revitalized. But at the same time, they're not so much for the folks who used to work in those spaces. The idea really came about when a confluence of, my past experiences and then, nerding out on that research that came out. And I just, went in. So that's the impetus behind Adaptive Commons. And it's just something that is near and dear to me. And I feel like, I talk about like chapters of work that I do. I feel like this is the next volume of work that I do.
Man, it's such a brilliant idea and sort of take on building out an ecosystem in real life. Usually we think ecosystems as maybe like digital ecosystems or ecosystems in sort of business. So this is like a societal ecosystem that is just amazing to think about. How do you get going as far as, do you find a vacant school like you found a vacant lot in Memphis? Is it just researching the United States for, vacant schools? I know we had one in here in Kansas City, Missouri. It was a beautiful old middle school that was just vacant, but turned into apartment buildings. Now, I think it was just more generic apartment buildings, not necessarily for first responders or teachers, or civil servant workers. But, the idea in general was there. But how do we get something like this off the ground from an idea standpoint, from a property standpoint, and then getting those civil servants actually in the building, whether it's leases or however it works? I guess, what are some of the, not necessarily hurdles or first steps that need to be taken for this to be successful?
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned Kansas City. I was just there about 3 weeks ago, and I likely was in the building that you described.
Shoot.
And,
now
I mean, and
hit me up when you come back.
yeah, and it's actually a great model. And then there's the middle school and then also the high school that was adapted. So you basically have one across the street from the other if we're talking about the same one.
Yep.
Whereas offices on one side and then residential on the other. It's amazing, adaptive reuse. And so, yeah, I was definitely there, kicking the tires on that and some other spaces there. So it actually leans into what you just asked. Unfortunately, thousands and thousands, I mean, really, millions of square feet of empty school buildings across the country. So they're not hard to find, right? Chicago had the largest school closure in history. They shut down 50 school buildings in 1 year. Many of them are still vacant, and this was just a little over 10 years ago. Philadelphia, in the same vein, not all shut down at the same time, but over time. And so, Kansas City, you can just, start naming the cities. And, I'm sure as people listen to this, they'll start thinking about, the empty school buildings that they've passed by in their respective neighborhoods. Unfortunately, not hard to find. I think for us, again, going back to, really working with, folks who are from the community, it's the reason why I was in Kansas City, quite frankly. There are folks who have the capacity, have the wherewithal, have the network, and have the community buy-in to turn these spaces around. And so what we're doing is we're narrowing in on those developers, right? Not the ones who just have like an idea to just monetize, an empty school building, but the folks who are actually thinking about public good and really having a public, putting forth a public service. We want to align with them. And, it's one of those things where, before like Adaptive Commons, as I would share with, family and friends, this wild idea I had to invest in the adaptive reuse of empty school buildings for teachers and other essential workers. I would start getting, articles that sent to me or newspapers or, reports sent. Now, every single day, whether it's on LinkedIn or on my email, I'm getting an inbound about a school that's vacant or a family friend or, a business partner who is looking to turn around a school. And so now it's made it fun for me to really, kick the tires on these prospective projects to think about what are the ones that are most viable and what are the ones that, serve the best use for housing for teachers and other essential workers versus those that, yes, they're empty, but maybe it's a different use that they, would be better for.
You're turning into a consulting firm now, all of a sudden.
In a sense, huh?
So I guess the big part of all this is capital, right? We still need capital formation to make these things happen. And a big term that I've talked with a lot of people about lately is catalytic capital. dive deeper down into it, it seems like a great use case and just a great use of public funds to maybe subsidize that risk for then private capital to come in and do some of these projects that actually are not very risky at all, it doesn't seem like. But I guess talk about maybe catalytic capital and how that is important in all this, isn't important in all this. Where does that fit in sort of the landscape of the future of adaptive commons?
It's super important. I think about, even with adaptive commons, when we were just getting off the ground, really behind the scenes, we're sort of like more so just a whisper campaign of the work we were doing. Our website wasn't really live or anything like that. We were doing a lot behind the scenes, and we had the privilege of being honored as an Echo and Green Fellow, which then totally put us on the map, right? Because they are the good housekeeping stamp of approval, right? And it signaled to the field, right, that we were doing something that was worth looking at. And that came with catalytic capital to really start to invest in some of the things that I've described around even our due diligence, how we're engaging with communities. And in the same vein with these school buildings, right? If you're, let's imagine a school building that it might cost $100 million to turn it around to create 100 apartments. Mm-hmm. And if it's historic and it can get historic tax credits. If it's in an area and it also has a commercial, a community commercial facing use that can get new markets tax credits. If there are ways to bring the cost down, if you will, there's always going to be this gap, right? And so it's why, one, we want the building to be low cost or no cost. And so think about the building as public incentive. That reduces the gap. But there's still this small gap in the grand scheme of things. $100 million, there still may be a gap of $5 million. It's that $5 million, that catalytic capital that allows for that project to go forward, right? All those other things are great, but they're all but for. You have to still have your capital stack secured. And if you're missing that $5 million, everything I just named just goes away, right? They're not stepping in unless you have everything else figured out. And your traditional folks aren't going to want to invest in something like this because it is unusual, right? There is no pattern recognition yet around adaptive reuse of school buildings for housing for teachers and other essential workers. It doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
We're hoping to create that field, right? To help create that field. And the way to do that is to bring a significant amount of catalytic capital, right? To pull that and then dole it out to those different projects that really can show that this is a successful model. This actually should be more turnkey than people think. And from there, it creates a whole new narrative around what these empty school buildings are. When you go to, you mentioned Amsterdam, you go to a city like Amsterdam, or, I was in London earlier this year, adaptive reuse, I'm not even sure that's in their lexicon, right? That's just something they do, right?
Yeah,
I've walked into buildings that were built in the 1300s that certainly aren't being used in the same way they were 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago.
I went to an amazing brewery in one of the most beautiful churches I've ever seen in my life in the Netherlands. I'm just saying, we don't do that at scale, but for that particular use case, it was amazing.
It's normalized, right? It is not oh my goodness. And, the narrative of, wow, don't shut my school down to turn it into blank. The reality is we're looking at schools that have already been closed or that are, slated to be closed. And there's a different narrative to have it's not closing the school, it's repurposing, right? If I walked into a school building today and told you I was going to move the kitchen to where the gym was and move the gym to where the auditorium was, no one would really, bat. They would go, okay, you're just moving some things around and it's still going to have an educational purpose. So in this case, if I walk into a school building that's empty, but I've decided, hey, there's an opportunity for us to invest in teachers that serve your families, your students, your neighborhood, we should also be open to that concept that this is still for public purpose. This is still for public use, not we're shutting something down and mothballing.
The other question I would have is obviously around affordability. And we're talking about civil servants that have some of the biggest impacts in our society, especially in our local communities, but they're not sort of on the higher end scale of economically of what we have in society. So how do we make it affordable for beautiful housing safe housing for like the most important people in our community.
Yeah, so this is, and we're really thinking about not just the missing middle, primarily the missing middle, right? It's described as 80 to 120 AMI in terms of average median income. And so that those are our teachers, our first responders, our civil servants, as we're describing. And the one thing that personally I think we should lean away from is concentrating anything, right? So we shouldn't concentrate poverty, just like we shouldn't concentrate wealth.
Yeah.
Just like we shouldn't concentrate only the missing middle. So what are the opportunities that we have to, use these public assets to primarily serve teachers and first responders and essential workers, and to also serve those who are below the median income of those groups, as well as those who might be above, right? To have that mix of community where, we're not focused on one sort of wealth spectrum or vertical over the other. So that's one way of I think we should look at it.
Man, it's there's so many dynamics that go into this. We mentioned, capital as being this really, really obviously important first step for all this. So let's say after capital is raised, and maybe we can, you can take some of the traditional maybe stuff from Memphis or Tulsa where it sort of blends real estate and residential, but you also had a commercial component to it as well. After capital is raised in maybe a project like this, what are some of the other possible hurdles or scenarios that you would face to actually get this to sort of completion?
Yeah, I mean, they're always where the markets are, right? I mean, we just recently the interest rates came down.
Yeah.
And so there was a time where construction prices just continue to go up, 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 up. And so even now we're looking at new technologies to go alongside the adaptive reuse that allow us to bring costs down. Because that's always going to be a hurdle, right? Keeping, staying within budget. So that, in the development space, that's always going to be a challenge, always something we'll keep an eye on. That's one thing. I think the other piece is just around ensuring that, there's a whole conversation around gentrification, and ensuring that, that communities don't gentrify. And frankly, I think the real challenge isn't about gentrification, is about displacement. Right. And so we want to ensure that whatever we invest in, that it ensures that no one is displaced. And so we retain a level of affordability so that the folks who live in the neighborhood still have the opportunity to live in the neighborhood, even as more new people come in. And so that, I think that will always be a challenge. There's just something that you have to be intentional about it, which is what makes it a challenge, right? You can sort of just take your eye off the ball and say, well, we've created this thing, and if you build it, they will come and everyone will be okay. But if you're not really focused on it, then that's just not going to be the case. And I believe, my parents were both educators. I was an educator, and, plenty of my family members were and are educators. I really feel like the profession isn't honored in the way that it should be. And so the other challenge is ensuring that teachers and other essential workers, that we honor the profession in the same way we honor, doctors. And, they can't afford to live near where they work, because we as a society have honored that in the way we pay them. And so in the same way, how do we honor teachers, you mentioned earlier, like to ensure that they still have a nice place to live that is affordable? Like that should just be the norm. Like you decided to get into a noble profession, you should be honored by where you live.
And just the walkability aspect of all this was such a tremendous experience for me when we lived in Amsterdam. I mean, you had small kids, you had people in their 80s. That was the community. It was people walking around and in the city, in a very busy, dense city. It is extremely, extremely livable. And I think the power in what the possibilities what this has is just that ability of not having transportation being this weight on your shoulder for your aspirations in life. Just getting places in America is really, really just difficult, hard, especially with weather. You're in beautiful California, right? So you don't have the emotional weather, but Kansas City, I'm from New Orleans, like weather changes, right? And so it's difficult for people just to get to work, to get to school, even for first responders to do their jobs and have to then maybe drive 35 minutes to go home. Like these jobs are also really intense. And there's such a comfort factor knowing that going home or going to work is not this thing that you have to overcome every day. And so I think the walkability aspect to all this is potentially amazing. I don't know if, assessing certain properties or location, if you look at like a walkability score or potential of what that does to, mental wellness, not even economic wellness, but just the mental capacity that it takes on people. Has that research come up at all when looking at doing certain projects?
Absolutely. And it's something that we look into. So, again, even, recently in Kansas City, looking at a project there, going around the neighborhood and actively, I was thinking about bike lanes, thinking about the actual building itself and, some of the uses that will, so, even as, I describe it, it's not just housing, it's primarily housing for teachers and essential workers. The other piece is having a commercial component that supports, that complements the housing side of everything, so that not only is there, we think about walkability to, go to and from that particular building, but even what's within that building, so that you have those amenities that you typically might have to drive,
Yeah.
5 miles to get. And so, you even mentioned, 35-minute drive. I mean, for some teachers, it's an hour, 2 hours each way. And
Crazy.
so how do we think about, we are actively thinking about walkability, what's happening in and around that neighborhood. And also with the investment that we're making, how does that catalyze, you talk about catalytic capital, right? How does that catalyze more investment? So you want to go all the way back to the work we did in Memphis and Hickory Hill. I remember there was a pizza shop that was about to go under, and we put our high school next door. So of course that pizza shop was back in business, right?
Man,
And then
absolutely.
in the same way, the medical clinic and dental clinic, they had an increase in customers because we had students who now, because it's next door, they weren't as shy to go in and get the medical, support and help that they needed. So when you have these sort of catalytic investments, it isn't just financial, right? We like to say our returns are bigger than financial, right? Because you start to see a whole neighborhood change in a way that, you just leave those assets alone. And I still call them assets because they are powerful and they should be used for our good. But if you just leave them alone, then, community just continues to go, spiral down.
Man, that pizza place should open snowball shop as well, or shaved ice. I don't know. We call in the South it's snowballs, but it's so hot. And I remember one of the schools I went to, there was a snowball stand. So like every day, right, you're gonna have students flock to this. I mean,
Of course.
the margins were amazing. I mean, I look back now, they own like, three of the shops that used to be there. They expanded so big, right? So like, yeah. Anyway, it brought me back there. I'll end on a couple questions here. The first would be, you mentioned you have people on LinkedIn, you have people emailing you. This issue is everywhere, right? And so determining, and I'll go back to New Orleans where I grew up after Katrina. I believe it was the first city ever to go to a complete charter school system. And, look, that will yield results or won't yield results, whatever it might be. And, there's still a ton of blight in New Orleans. It's a beautiful city, but it also has some areas of improvement. How does a city sort of take a next step into whether it's adaptive commons, where it's somebody else in the industry? How can a city get involved? How can local developers get involved? What are those steps that from your experience, somebody that might not be in the space, right, that maybe is coming from outside real estate developments, how can they get started into perhaps doing something like adaptive commons or getting involved with adaptive commons maybe in their community?
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned New Orleans. I'm thinking about the empty school building that's right there in the French Quarter. They're
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, similar to, I remember asking a friend of mine who is an engineer, architect, and I remember asking when I was looking to do that first project, like, hey, so what degree do I need to get to be a developer? Like, what do I need to,
Right.
what do I need to do? And he's just like, just start developing. And so I think I pass on that same advice, right? That if anyone is in the neighborhood and they see an empty school building and it's something they walk by or it's across the street from their home and they want to do something about it, I mean, the first thing is to do something, right? Like you can think about it, you can dream about it. And I like to say to folks, like, dreaming is easy, right? You literally can do that in your sleep. But what does it mean to actually start making phone calls, talk to your school board and talk to the folks at the school district who own those buildings, right? To say, hey, I want to do something about it. And then I would say, if you go another level up, there are local developers who are interested in this space, right? And we're not doing this as a development shop, right? This is something that I believe it's so big that not a single development shop can figure this
Sure.
out. However, let's say, let's use New Orleans as an example. If someone saw that building in the French Quarter and then talked to the school district, I would imagine they need to come back with a developer in mind that actually could turn that space around, that has the capacity and the wherewithal to figure that out. And then we would certainly, as Adaptive Commons, would want to support that effort. For us, it's supporting it on a financial side. And you mentioned the consulting piece earlier. We also are open to providing that, intellectual resource to help folks figure out the capital stack as they move the project along and even how to navigate the development process.
The last question I'll have is just about the future. And I know this is sort of a new venture, and it's got so many different aspects to it, and it's just a massive problem and market. But when you look 3 to 5 years ahead and maybe down the line, what are some of the goals and successes you and the team would like to achieve?
We talk about this often. We want this idea of adaptive reuse to just be a common thing, right? No pun intended on Adaptive Commons.
We want people... pun was intended. That was an intended one.
We certainly want, the idea when, people see empty school buildings, that the first thing that triggers is, oh, why is this empty? This should be adapted. This should be something, not this should be torn down, not we should just build something on the parking lot, but instead, like, this building should be something, could be something, and should have a public purpose. We want that to be the norm. Just like if you saw a car without, the tires on, you would go, something's off. Somebody needs to fix that. And so in the same vein, we want that to be, the common piece. And I mean, bigger than that, and I mentioned this earlier, we want the profession for teaching to be, the teaching profession to be honored again. And we think this is like one step towards that. And so we might not have, like, as Adaptive Commons, we might not have the capacity to pay teachers more as they deserve. But if we can give them an affordable place to live where they actually want to live, that's near where they work, that reduces transportation costs, reduces the stress, right? And there's another way of honoring the profession, and they might actually feel like they've gotten a pay bump because they can actually live near where they work in a place that is high quality and affordable. And so honoring the profession is the biggest thing. And so I like to share too, when a teacher is more engaged and loves what they do, that means students have better outcomes, and families and have better outcomes. And so there's this ripple effect that's just not about the built environment and the physical side of it, but it's what I studied, like what the built environment does to the psyche is super important. And so that's something that we think about as well. So 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we want it to just be a common thing that these empty school buildings are being turned around and being adapted for the civic purpose.
Amazing, man. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you so much for
thank you
for taking the leap and the challenge and the risk of just doing something that was interesting to you. And I love when people come outside of a profession. Usually their expertise from outside of that profession coming into that, it usually helps in their ability to actually be successful. And so maybe not real estate, maybe it's something else, but I love that journey and that aspect of diving into something that you knew nothing about, but you had skills that would adapt to that sector, if we pun intended. So,
yeah, pun is intended.
Man, inspirational story, man, inspirational journey. Thanks so much for taking the time, and best of luck to you and the team for the next decade.
I really appreciate it, Grant. I enjoyed talking with you and love talking about this work. So this is a great way to continue my day. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.